Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein paid off sexual harassment cases.
У скандального голливудского продюсера Харви Вайнстайна начались.
But within days of a New York Times report chronicling his alleged misconduct with women,
A flood of accusations of sexual misconduct against Harvey Weinstein.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here's what we're looking at this week. Exposure, what the Harvey Weinstein story, the one the U.S. media failed to report until now, says about the relationship between the film industry and the news business. Some people do stand up to Hollywood. They work at the CIA and the Pentagon. Iranians say goodbye to one of their oldest online institutions. Klub is shutting down. And a car bomb kills a journalist in Malta. Her son calls the country a mafia state. In Hollywood, it was one of those open secrets, something widely known that no one was prepared to say out loud. Harvey Weinstein, one of the most successful producers in the movie business, a serial sexual abuser, using his immense power and influence to force women, including staff, interns, and mostly actresses, to succumb to his will. The fame of those involved made this story headline news, raising the question of why something that took place over a period of decades was not reported until now. It wasn't for a lack of sources. At least two major media outlets have been accused by journalists who chased the Weinstein story of burying it. There's a conflict of interest at play here. The news industry bathes in the bright lights and reflected glamour of the film industry and relies on its revenues, the ad dollars that the studios spend. The dozens of women Harvey Weinstein wronged were not the only parties in this story who feared his influence, his power to make or break careers. Our starting point this week is the headquarters of the Weinstein Company in New York City. Typically, stories about the abuse of power, conflict of interest, and the suppression of journalism have, at their center, some kind of political figure. Not this one.
The case of Harvey Weinstein and other men in power who have been accused of sexual abuse, they've been able to hide their misconducts publicly for several decades because of the power structures that exist in society. They know that they're at the top, they're the boss. They have the money and the power and the influence to make sure that if they're accused of any of these crimes, that they can hush it up. This is all about power.
How open was that secret, Harvey Weinstein's treatment of women? Gawker, an online news site with a taste for scandal, reported on it in 2015, inviting victims to share their experiences. But the story went nowhere. If the U.S. mainstream media were interested, they lacked the appetite to follow up.
So it's not that it never was referred to, but there was never this big investigative journalism that really brought it out into the open until the New York Times did it this month. What is the reason for that? Well, he's been a very powerful guy. He's had many friends in the media, in entertainment, in politics, and it was the kind of thing that people sort of looked away from.
His real talent and skill was in managing publicity, getting up advertising campaigns to win people Oscars. If you're like Vanity Fair magazine and you wanted interviews with those people, he could greenlight it or deny it. And so he had a network in place. When that Italian actress did come through with a legal claim against Weinstein, suddenly page 6 of the New York Post was running like all these articles against her about her, her past. And that was clearly coming out of Weinstein himself and using page 6 as a tool of retribution. So I would like to see people actually not just investigate Weinstein, but investigate the people who were actively complicit in that publicity machine.
There are many reasons why a news organization would comply with the wishes of a Hollywood mogul. Some films have advertising budgets in the tens of millions of dollars. News outlets need those ad revenues. And whether journalists cover politics or entertainment, access matters. Alienate a major player in Hollywood, and you might lose your spot on the red carpet at the Oscars or that exclusive interview with a movie star. The New York Times broke the Weinstein story. But a journalist who used to work there, Sharon Waxman, says she took the story to the Times in 2004, that the paper was pressured to drop it, and did. The Times disputes that. Ronan Farrow is an investigative reporter for NBC who said he had the Weinstein story backed by multiple sources and an audio tape months before the Times finally published it, but that NBC refused to put it on the air. Farrow eventually took the story to a magazine, The New Yorker, which published its version shortly after the Times did.
Why did you end up reporting this story for The New Yorker and not for NBC News?
I walked into the door at The New Yorker with an explosively reportable piece that should have been public earlier, and immediately, obviously, The New Yorker recognized that, and it is not accurate to say that it was not reportable. In fact, there were multiple determinations that it was reportable at NBC.
With the Farrow thing, I mean, it's a much more recent story, and it's been published in The New Yorker, which is kind of like known for not publishing anything that they can't back up. So the fact that it was able to go through the New Yorker fact-checking system kind of indicates that NBC dropped the ball.
Ronan Farrow had enough to go forward. Although the news organizations won't admit it, I think that they just felt intimidated and they didn't want to deal with the consequences.
NBC owns Bravo, and Harvey Weinstein was the producer of Project Runway, which is owned by NBC. So, you know, you pat my back, I'll pat yours. You know, we don't want to rock the boat. These media conglomerates are so big, and so there's so many divisions. The news divisions get compromised because the entertainment divisions can put the kibosh on a story that may threaten that part of the enterprise. And that's very frightening.
In journalism, sometimes the best question to ask isn't why, it's why now. And theories on why the Weinstein story is more newsworthy now than in years past range from the shifting fortunes of his company to signs that when it comes to certain men in positions of power in America, the times are changing.
The reason why Harvey was taken down now, it is my firm belief, is because he wasn't that powerful anymore. He wasn't making money for other people. So 10 years ago, he's raking in the Oscars, he's raking in the cash. Nobody's gonna give him up. There's no way that all these women could have come out and felt comfortable enough to say what they said eventually to the New York Times.
There are factors that have enabled media outlets to finally report on the Harvey Weinstein case. They have finally been enabled to do that because of the other cases that have come forward and have been successfully covered in the news, such as Donald Trump, Bill Cosby, Bill O'Reilly, Roger Ailes. They felt empowered because of the news coverage that has been going on.
We turn next year to stunning new developments after the flood of accusations of sexual misconduct against Harvey Weinstein.
As satisfying as it must be for Harvey Weinstein's many victims to finally see him get the coverage he deserves, it must gall them to watch the same mainstream media outlets that shied away from the story now feasting on it, moralizing over it, calling it something they should have called it long ago: breaking news. On the social media side, the Me Too movement has resonated with women all over the world, with their own stories of harassment or sexual assault in the workplace. But sharing a hashtag, highlighting a serious social problem is one thing. Correcting it, particularly in a place like Hollywood, is quite another.
A lot of this has gone on for a long, long time. The phrase casting couch was first used in 1931, the well-worn Hollywood tradition where actresses kind of have to sleep with producers or directors to get positions. We have many stories from the so-called golden age of Hollywood of people like Judy Garland or Marilyn Monroe being abused. So this is kind of like almost like an accepted part of Hollywood.
There's a lot of hypocrisy going around. There's a lot of finger pointing, and there's not a lot of people finger pointing while looking at a mirror and saying, how did you help this out? How did you propagate this? And the problem is that if you don't understand what you did wrong and how you were a part of this, how is that really going to change anything?
The news media needs to really take a look at itself. And I think with social media on our backs now, we have an obligation to be even more accountable, or we're going to end up being embarrassed.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week. On the Mediterranean island nation of Malta, a journalist who used last year's Panama Papers data dump to expose widespread corruption has been killed by a car bomb. Investigative reporter Daphna Caruana Galizia ran a blog called Running Commentary that sometimes attracted more online readers than all of the island's newspapers combined. The consortium behind the Panama Papers won the Pulitzer Prize for its journalism. Caruana Galizia led the team's investigations in Malta and effectively forced Prime Minister Joseph Muscat to call early elections there. Muscat has denied that he and his wife used offshore bank accounts to hide payments from the ruling family of Azerbaijan. Muscat called the murder an attack on press freedom. He said, "Everyone knows Ms. Caruana Galizia was a harsh critic of mine, both politically and personally, but nobody can justify this barbaric act." Caruana Galizia's son Matthew said his mother was assassinated because she stood between the rule of law and those who sought to violate it. This is where we are, a mafia state, where you will be blown to pieces for exercising your basic freedoms. Iranians witnessed the end of a social media era this past week when one of the country's oldest online platforms, Klub, announced it was shutting down. Both Facebook and Twitter are banned in Iran, and Klub, which launched 12 years ago, filled part of that gap. The site frequently clashed with the authorities for failing to take down politically sensitive material or pictures showing women without headscarves, which is illegal in the Islamic Republic. According to the company's director, Klub had been taken offline 3 times. The most recent block lasted 28 days. He said that his team no longer had the energy and enthusiasm to keep fighting. Instagram and the messaging service Telegram are both available in Iran and are booming. President Hassan Rouhani, who was re-elected earlier this year, said he would ease social media restrictions, but he has yet to live up to that promise. You can add Mauritania to the list of governments that have suddenly accused critical media outlets of failing to pay their taxes and shutting them down. On October 17th, the country's broadcasting authority ordered 5 privately owned TV channels to close for failing to fulfill their financial agreements. Dava, Sahel TV, Chinguit, Al Wataniya, and Al Murabitun were all ordered to close, leaving just one channel, the state-owned TVM, on the air. All of this happens in the aftermath of a contentious referendum held 2 months ago, which President Mohammed Ould Abdelaziz called to expand the powers of the presidency. Several journalists, including Al Jazeera correspondent Baba Ould Harma, have been harassed or arrested while reporting on political unrest. The Weinstein story was suppressed by Hollywood, using its legal and financial muscle to keep a lid on it. But there are also power centers in the U.S. government that can dictate to Hollywood: the Pentagon and the CIA. We've examined the U.S. military's symbiotic relationship with Hollywood before, how the Department of Defense offers filmmakers access to telegenic military hardware and personnel at minimal cost in return for the right to alter storylines and veto scenes the Pentagon does not like. Thanks to a new trove of documents, a clearer picture is emerging of the CIA's attempts to control its on-screen image. The intelligence agency's track record of political assassinations, coup plotting overseas, and occasional support for terror groups offer countless possibilities for potential screenwriters. However, the agency works with filmmakers to portray a varnished version of its activities, removing scenes and changing plot lines the CIA sees as unflattering. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on America's military intelligence entertainment complex.
Watch any big-budget war movie or take in a spy thriller, and you could walk away not knowing just how much your movie experience was shaped by the Pentagon or CIA. However, a trove of official documents obtained under U.S. Freedom of Information laws and published this year detail the dealings between filmmakers and intelligence officials at Langley, Virginia, the CIA headquarters.
Probably the best known are Zero Dark 30 and Argo, but they've also assisted the television show Homeland.
How do we deal with homegrown, violent jihadists?
They've also assisted Alias.
You work for the very enemy you thought you were fighting.
24.
Tell me where the device is!
A CBS series called The Agency.
Then he slit his throat.
They assisted a film called The Sum of All Fears, starring Ben Affleck.
Captain Jack Ryan, CIA. Charlie Wilson's War is a really good example where they maintain the idea that, are we really doing the right thing by arming the Mujahideen, the forerunners of the Al-Qaeda terrorist organization in Afghanistan in the 1980s? They kind of question that in a kind of jokey way. Like the last caption in the film Charlie Wilson's War is something like, "Oh, we came, we saw, but then we mucked up the end game," or some joke. You know, it's like, no, that's not what you did actually, and you know it because the original script and the original book that you base this on doesn't say that. You armed terrorists in a really horrific conflict. It's the whole organisation behind it at a systematic level, and that turned Charlie Wilson's War into this, you know, saccharine, benign movie.
Throughout the 1990s, the CIA worked with Hollywood very specifically on movies that portrayed the CIA as sort of a heroic force protecting America. Most of the movies were based on Tom Clancy books, actually. So you had A Hunt for Red October and that entire franchise. You know, the lead character, Jack Ryan, is this like super heroic figure, and he's like constantly, you know, taking down bad guys and saving America, saving the world from various threats, whether it's Islamic terrorism or the IRA or ultimately white supremacists.
Between them, the CIA and the US Department of Defense have had varying levels of input, from simply clarifying points for authenticity to actually writing parts of scripts on more than 1,800 movies and TV shows. When it comes to influencing filmmakers, shaping the story, the Pentagon is usually in a stronger negotiating position than the CIA. Because of the hardware at its disposal, it can shut down a movie before a scene is ever shot.
The Department of Defense is actually a much more powerful player in the entertainment industry for basically financial reasons. The Department of Defense has expensive toys. They have submarines, they have aircraft carriers, they have tanks, and they have the personnel to operate each of those things. So if a filmmaker wants to make a war movie, they often will approach the Department of Defense and basically ask to borrow that equipment. And the Department of Defense will say, maybe, but can I see your script? And they will either say, this is great, we love the way that the military is portrayed in this, we will go ahead and collaborate with you. Or they may say, we hate the way that we're portrayed and refuse to participate.
When the Pentagon does agree to support a film, there can be some scripting strings attached. And the Vietnam War is clearly a sore point. In The Hulk, a reference to a US operation that poisoned Vietnamese farmland was removed. And in the Bond film Tomorrow Never Dies, a suggestion that the US did not win the war was cut out. In Iron Man, a reference to soldier suicides was removed, again at the Pentagon's insistence. The CIA's presence in Hollywood is harder to detect. It goes back to the early days of the Cold War and was designed to counter a propaganda effort coming out of the Soviet Union. The CIA placed undercover agents in major studios where they monitored left-wing screenwriters and directors. This was at the height of Cold War paranoia, and Hollywood was under the scrutiny of the US Congress.
Is investigating alleged communist influence and infiltration in the moving picture industry.
The agency started influencing scripts. One senior executive at Paramount Pictures, working covertly for the CIA, described how, to counter what the Soviets were saying about the persecution of African Americans, quote, well-dressed Negroes, unquote, would be planted in certain films.
What happens in the 1990s is that the Cold War ends, and all of a sudden the CIA is left without a visible, viable enemy to justify its existence. If they were going to continue, they had to do something to improve their public image. And one of the responses to that crisis was to begin to work with Hollywood to convince the American public that, and Congress, that they were still worth being an institution.
In 1996, the CIA's Entertainment Liaison Office in Hollywood began offering free support to movies that featured the agency. Chase Brandon, an intelligence agent and cousin of actor Tommy Lee Jones, was the CIA's first liaison officer. He's credited as a technical advisor on a host of Hollywood blockbusters, such as The Recruit, starring Al Pacino as a veteran CIA officer.
Our failures are known, our successes are not.
In reality, Brandon was far more than a mere advisor on The Recruit. He helped pitch the film to Disney, that eventually produced and distributed the movie, and was involved in the script writing.
The Recruit.
As another CIA liaison officer put it, Hollywood is the only way the public learns about the agency. Which begs the question, should the public be learning about the CIA from the CIA without even being aware of the agency's role in the production process? These issues became public with the release of one of the biggest CIA Hollywood collaborations to date, Zero Dark 30, a film about the search for Osama bin Laden.
You really believe this story? Osama bin Laden?
The Zero Dark 30 was a really unusual case, I think, for the CIA in terms of how it works with Hollywood. The CIA gave the director and screenwriter a lot of access to the agency. They bounced a lot of ideas back and forth, and they wanted to really kind of tightly control the narrative that this was putting out. It backfired, though, because very quickly after the movie came out, it was criticized for suggesting that torture somehow had played a role in the information gathering that led to the capture and assassination of Osama bin Laden.
Torture and the CIA's use of it, especially after 9/11, were already under investigation when Zero Dark 30 was released. The Senate Intelligence Committee wrote a letter to the production studio, Sony Pictures. They said, "We believe the film is grossly inaccurate and misleading in its suggestion that torture resulted in information that led to the location of Osama bin Laden." Zero Dark 30's director, Catherine Bigelow, eventually had to respond to the allegation that her film was making the CIA's case for torture. In an editorial for the Los Angeles Times, she wrote that critics were, quote, confusing depiction with endorsement. Torture was, as we all know, employed in the early years of the hunt. That doesn't mean it was the key to finding bin Laden. It means it's a part of the story we couldn't ignore.
That's more of a problem with the film industry and the creative industry. Total disinterest in the responsibility of the ideological products that they create. And this is why you can have a very liberal town full of very liberal or even sometimes left-wing celebrities and directors, but actually they create films that are very much in keeping with the American Empire project.
The CIA rarely has any kind of public credit that suggests that they had any hand in shaping the narrative of that film. That lack of transparency I find incredibly problematic because it doesn't allow the viewer to be a smart, critical viewer.
How about this? Why don't they just have at the beginning of each film, made with the support of the Central Intelligence Agency, let's see how long the practice lasts then. Because it won't. Because people will look at it and say, oh, it's one of those propaganda films.
Finally, back to the Harvey Weinstein story. The fact that his atrocious behavior went unreported for so long has led to allegations as yet unconfirmed of soul-searching in the entertainment industry and in the news media. But the signs of what kind of man Weinstein was were out there for all to see. It's just that no one did anything about it. We've collected a few clips, the odd joke or throwaway line from figures in the film world that prove that Weinstein's reputation as a sexual predator was known years before that explosive report in the New York Times was published, bringing him down. We'll see you next time here at the Listening Post.
The 2012 nominees for Best Performance by an Actress in a Supporting Role. Congratulations, you five ladies no longer have to pretend to be attracted to Harvey Weinstein.
Are you here of your own free will? Has someone coerced you into being here?
Do you count Harvey Weinstein as a coercer?
I'm not afraid of anyone in show business. I turned down intercourse with Harvey Weinstein on no less than 3 occasions out of 5.
Now, Harvey Weinstein is I don't know whether he's in some kind of organized crime now. But he used to be like some kind of junior mob kind of guy, right? He was like in the mob auxiliary.
That's what they tell me.
Yeah, and now he's like a big, powerful film guy, right?
Yes, I do all my movies for Harvey Weinstein. That's Miramax for all of you.
Yeah.
And I'm lucky to do them there, but he will coerce you to do with things.
And so Harvey said, I tell you what, go on and talk about your movie. Is that what Harvey said?
Yeah.
And in return, what will Harvey do for you?
Nothing.
Really? Well, what's wrong with that equation? As the kids say, you do the math.
Do you have any advice for a young girl moving to Hollywood?
I'll get lively with us. Harvey Weinstein invites you to a private party in the Four Seasons downtown.